Want to put up your deck, Vikas, or did you want me to put it up?
No, all good. I'm ready to go.
Okay. Do that all for you.
So should we wait for a little longer or should we get started?
No, it's 9:32, so these ones were here on time. So you start. I will just let people in as we go, and we're recording it. So if anyone misses anything critical at the start, they will be able to watch the recording afterwards on YouTube. But yes, you cannot wait. You should just go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are right now. Let's get started and talk about data workflows on Azure. My name is Vikas Rajput, but let's get on to the agenda and then we'll get on to introductions as well. So let's start the conversation with understanding electric grid. Now, if you're a little confused, that's all right, because we started with data workflows and now we're talking of electric grid. The reason is I'm actually going to look at how there are some parallels between how electricity is produced and delivered and kind of transmitted and distributed and stuff like that, and how I see similar patterns with data as well. In particular, what happens with electricity, right? You generate that, you transmit it, you distribute it, and you consume it, right? And quite interestingly, similar things, similar patterns are visible when it comes to data as well, be it a data warehouse project, be it just a content related project or AI and machine learning. Some or all of these are part and parcel of the solution, generally speaking. So who's this person talking to you? My name is Vikas Rajput. I am here in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm part of the Microsoft team. Thanks again, Michelle, for having me and giving me a window to talk to some of the amazing learners that we have on this call. And predominantly, just very briefly, when I talk about myself, the way I look at my areas of work, I focus on architecture first and foremost. Data is obviously the central theme, and hence the reason why it's in center. And then other than that, automation is another area that I am hugely passionate about and something that I look out for. Doesn't matter, what delivery, what specific thing that I'm doing on the day. All right, so let's probably get started. And if you don't mind, I'll probably kill my camera feed just because I don't want to distract you with everything else that's happening. And I want you to be able to focus on what's there in front of you. So let's talk about electric grid as an example. Let's delve a little deeper into what's going on and why is it that I'm thinking that's probably a good story to kind of, weave around. At a very high level, and let me take some time just so, if this is a new concept to you, at least, or if you have not seen this in past, at least we have absorbed it a little more. So when it comes to electricity grid or how it is produced and then hence at the end reaches us as consumers, so predominantly you will have um, your generation of electricity, which is it can be a battery driven source, or it can be a solar, or it can be a fuel generated or coal generated, right? Depending on where you are. And again, I don't want to get into that and start that bigger debate of global warming and everything, but these are apparent sources of energy which produce electricity. Now, obviously, this is a rather simplistic representation because there is tons and tons of more details which goes into every one of these basically, right? How it is generated, how the telemetry is being measured, how they're controlled for safety purposes, for capacity purposes, and what have you, right? Anyways, The idea is that you generate electricity and there are different sources for electricity, right? Once this is all generated, um, predominantly it enters the transmission phase. And it's not like you generate electricity on one particular power plant and that's kind of somewhat in your neighborhood and just reaches your house as well. It doesn't happen like that. Solar and everything is a bit of an exception right now, but to be very fair, even with solar electricity and everything, Tesla and few others which are gaining a lot of prominence and popularity now, they actually have a lot of electronics and electricity that somebody, of the tradesperson, so to speak, has to come in and really install that. Only then it is in a state which is consumable by us, even in our households. Right. So let's keep that aside. Once this is all generated, this is not at a scale, it's not at a voltage that we can just plug in our day-to-day appliances in household appliances and start consuming that straight away. That's where the transmission lines comes in. Generally speaking, these sources are pretty massive. They work in their own capacity, almost like untouchables. They have their own production and all the rigor that happens around it. They basically are operating at a much larger scale, and a daily consumer is not kind of in that capacity to go and directly hook onto them, generally speaking. Right. You still need operations, you still need people who are monitoring the system or controlling the system, but still, the general idea is that normal day-to-day users, they are not kind of in that capacity to go and directly hook onto it for various reasons. um, and that's where the transmission comes about. So transmission in lines are basically used where voltage generally has been stepped up so that it can, transmit it across wider ranges. It can be taken from source A to destination B, whatever have you. Once it reaches the point of distribution, this is where the distribution comes about, right? Distribution is a different section altogether, and it's generally it's quite confusing at times because in a normal scenario, especially when we start talking about data, there are times when we do think about, okay, transmission and probably distribution is exactly one and the same thing. But my experience has been that it's probably better, especially in enterprise scale scenarios, that you kind of look at them separately. Anyways, let's come back to electricity part as well. The distribution is where there is high voltage sort of electricity, everything that's going on in the main transmission lines. And there are distribution centers, which basically steps down the voltage. And that's when it's actually ready to be distributed for the points of consumption. The points of consumption being some critical infrastructure. It can be, your traffic lights, your hospitals, some of the key institutions which are critical to, operation and efficiency of state, of a federal agency, or for the kind of, government bodies and everything. Right. So some parts are electrical and yet are feeding into key critical infrastructure like trains, buses, traffic lights, hospitals, and hence there is a different sort of a rigor in that capacity. Then there is the normal day-to-day consumption. It's not like it's not important, but they are also quite critical because end of day, all of this, if you think about it, is actually standing because of this, right? It's the daily consumer who is consuming it. Without people, there is nothing. So that's another line of consumption, which has more to do with retail consumption as such, you and I, basically. And then lastly, you have the so-called um, corporate or industrial consumption of electricity, and that's where I don't know if you will see the difference here, but apparently, at least I've tried to make this green line a bit more thicker, and that's basically indicating that there is a different capacity of electricity that's going down there, right? So basically, that's the consumption. So the idea is that you generate electricity. There are different sources for that. you transmit data, you transmit data because you're basically pulling all of it together and then kind of taking it all in one place in one direction or multiple directions. Distribution is where you're basically trying to get electricity ready for a normal consumption scenario, right? And then there are individual consumption patterns and scenarios as well. So consumption is not one big block consumption. This is, a myriad of consumption patterns that you might see across different groups. So now let's take data and data as a story, and then think about how this is kind of stacking up when we look at it as electricity as an example, right? So that's your components of typical data grid, right? I've stolen the word electric grid to data grid there. But again, I'm not inventing something new here. Also, just kind of going with the rhyming words and everything. Um, and again, just a bit of a word of caution here that I'm actually going to drop some of the Azure Data Services names here right now. If you're not sure of them, if you're not aware of them, please don't mind putting that as a question on the chat window. I'm trying to keep an eye out. As long as the questions are a bit limited, I can absorb that. But if it goes beyond a limit, I'll see. But at least I can reference back to it. There are some references at the top, but I'm basically not focused on individual data services. So this is not the focus today. But I'm happy to come back to that later if you like. So first, let's talk about generation, right? Obviously, there were, if you remember, there were different sources or different generation sources for electricity. There was coal and fuel and wind energy, and then there was electric and everything. In this particular case, I'm saying it doesn't matter, right? There are enterprise grade data sources, and they are the ones which are generating this data, right? They can be applications, they can be events, they can be IoT devices. Doesn't matter what it is. The idea is that there is data being generated, and there is, generally speaking, a normal sort of um, acronym generally which is being used, and that is called ODS, which is Operational Data Store. So operational data store can be any relational data store. It can be even non-relational data store. You talk about SQL servers, MySQL, PostgreSQL, MongoDB, Cassandra, anything that comes to you. Basically, there are data services on Azure and beyond, which are more close to applications, which is more close to online transactions and fast transactions as such. The idea is that there are applications which are generating data, and that's what it is. Those are traditional OS or operational data stores, as I call them. But then in more recent times, I would probably say more recent decades actually, um, there are also event hubs and IoT hubs which have gained a lot of and garnered a lot of attention as well. Um, Event hubs are where applications can go and throw their events and messages, and there are other applications which will receive it. IoT hubs are obviously for IoT devices. Devices can come on and go or whatever. They can exchange their messages, their alerts, their data points, whatever telemetry that they're capturing, and basically keep registering that onto IoT hubs. But the key kind of generalized pattern in that case is that this is generation of data, right? And then next to it comes about transmission. Now, transmission, these listing of services that I'm providing, they're not absolute comprehensive. These are just some sample name drops basically here, if you like. So there is something like Synapse Link. And again, Synapse is a much bigger ecosystem. I'll probably show you a visual of what exactly that is, just to exhibit a bit more, because Synapse is just too wide of a service to comprehend as well for few at least. Synapse Link is a component which is basically allowing your operational data store systems, at least some of them, receive the data from applications and in near real time transmit that data onto your Synapse data warehouse in near real time, right? So it doesn't wait for anything else. As the operational data store is receiving data, for example, if it's a Cosmos database or something, it will read that, and then almost near real time, it will transfer it to the Synapse serverless or Synapse services, and then do aggregations and analytics on top of that. But the idea is that grab the information as early as possible. Azure Data Factory, I'm sorry I've dropped a synonym without explaining that, but ADF, which is Azure Data Factory, that is also quite a useful service there. And we have some reference architectures coming, so we will talk a little more about this. Another service which is quite interesting and something that I like a lot is Event Grid. Event Grid is also similar on this. So imagine you have event hubs, which are basically capturing individual data points for events which are occurring within the applications. An event grid is quite literally the grid where these events can be kind of, transitioned and transferred and transmitted over to different other consumption points, basically, and they can do some decisions on base of that and do certain things, right? But the idea is that once they land on event grid, it can reach its destination, and then whichever application can interpret that event can do something about it. But that's kind of part of the overall data grid, if I may use that word here. Data grid is not a thing, by the way. I'm just using it just to exhibit what we are talking about um, in the kind of in the sense of what this is about. Let's jump on to distribution now, right? The transmission part of it is basically how the data has been generated, and it's in its form of what it is, in its raw format, generally speaking. You basically go and bring it forward and ready for consumption in certain capacity, right? That is the key difference between transmission and distribution. Distribution, you're basically doing some transformations. You are making some changes to the data. You're applying some aggregations, you're applying some logic, you're filtering data out, or you're interpreting data in some regards, right? And that's where distribution is. Basically, distribution is more about I've got the raw data which has been transmitted over from X number of different sources where it was generated, and I have that now ready to be accessed by me as a service. But then for it to be consumed, it needs to be distributed, and that distribution is on the basis of certain criterias. Either that's an interpretation. So for example, dates are coming in. I don't want every single data point. I just want data, or I just want to analyze the data which was received in last 10 minutes, right? That's just one of the ways, for example. But there are more of such avenues as well. That's where a lot of different services are there. So distribution is more about receiving data which is ready to be consumed by other services, interpreted in certain ways, or stored in a particular way so that the subsequent consumption of that data is easier. And that's where, again, Azure Data Factory sits in, because Azure Data Factory not just brings the data in from source A to target B, it can also transform data. It can apply logic. It has tons of other integration points, for example. Storage account is also an interesting service there because it can become an endpoint for transmission. I can receive data from 20 different data sources, and you will see that as a reference architecture, by the way. And I just want to put that all together in one place. But then in storage account, I have put in some logic so that I can merge data from 3 data sources, and I can store other 70 data sources data in a completely separate format. And yet, from consumption point of view, I can direct these users to or services to respective containers, if I may use that term here, right? There are other such services as well. So logic apps, again, it can, as you can, derive out of it. Logic apps is basically applying or letting you apply logic on data that is stored somewhere in certain services and create applications with that. So if you think about this, for me, the way I look at data, it's not about data in a data service. Data can be a flat file, it can be a PDF, it can be an image file, it can be a video recording, whatever it is. Basically, you have consumption either as a reporting tool or as a machine learning or AI capability or as an application as well. So all of that is, for me, consumption. Distribution can also be done by Synapse as well, because Synapse has some overlap with Azure Data Factory and Storage Account as a service, and then Stream Analytics. So especially in case of event hubs and IoT hubs, it could also happen that event hubs capture the data and then they transfer it over the event grid, for example. But then that stream of information actually gets into Stream Analytics, which can receive a window of data of 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, and apply some analytics on top of that and just distribute that aggregate, that analytics that it has been able to derive for the last window of data that it has received. Again, some transformation if you think about it, right? And then lastly is your consumption tier. So we'll jump onto some examples, by the way. So don't get too bogged down with this. I know I've spent some time on this particular slide, but I just wanted to get the understanding fairly clear here. Consumption is where a lot of different services can be there, right? So it can be Synapse Analytics. We will look at that. Azure Machine Learning, for example, you want to just analyze data and you want to train with it or you want to test with it and make some predictions, for example. But when you go and do training, let's say you want to do training against 2 months data, right? So again, that's a consumption and with some distribution constraints if you think about it. And then you want to test it against daily data that's coming in. Again, that's a separate consumption pattern with some distribution constraints around it. Cognition services, AI and everything, and then Power Platform, a much wider ecosystem of Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, and then a whole kind of whole world of applications. If you think about it as well, they also can fit in here. Now, one thing I want to also focus on is if you just zoom in here, what is actually happening is if you see that there is a data kind of this store that I've created here, and what I mean by this is that it's not just that you're doing a lot of transformation or consumption or whatever. There are times when you can, and in some cases you should, think about retaining that transformed data so that you don't have to rely on transmission all the time. So there is some sort of storage which will be required or should be there, let's say from ADF perspective or storage account perspective or Synapse perspective, on the basis of what interpretations it has done or transformation it has done. I think somebody has gone off mute. Thanks. And the same thing is there for different applications as well. So it's not just that this data grid is going about, and obviously there is source data that's coming in, it's being transmitted, then it's distributed. So at point of distribution, you might store some data. But these applications or these consumption points, if I may call them, they also can have their own interpretation of data or master data and some business rules off the back of which they might interpret data differently as well. Yeah. Let's probably carry on and let's look at some examples. And the first one I want to do is just show you a particular service that I've created. So A pretty simple thing I've done, I've just hosted up certain applications. So I've created this. I'm not going to go into the details, but in Azure, I've basically created um, a resource group, and within the resource group, I've basically created some of the services, right? So the particular service which is of interest to me is a web app. So I'm talking of generation example right now. So let's talk about examples of different stages. So at this stage, I'm talking about a web app, Azure web app, which is basically nothing but an application. You can think of it as the one installed on your desktop or on a server. This is basically completely cloud native as such. This application is actually talking to, oh, sorry, this particular database. Okay, there are tons of other things. There is app inside and everything. There is no point going in there. But if I just go quickly on this particular application, so you can see if I just hit that, it's basically running like a website and I can do certain things in here. So this is all running on Azure right now, right? I have got this going. I can, and all of this is basically talking to that database that I was talking about, right? So Parts Unlimited is the one that it's talking to. And I can do certain things. I can log in with my account. And from then on, I can do certain things. I can go to any of these. Which one is that? Okay, I like this one. Actually, no, I will go with this one, right? So this one is good. Again, I can do different things, but let's just go and check it out. And I'll put in my detail here. Actually, I'll just call it Rajput and 123, whatever. That's that. This is 2232 name street, and then Melbourne. Vic, this doesn't matter because so interestingly, this is actually taking US address, so please ignore that for a little bit. And then I will say, nope, that's fine. And very interestingly, it says, what is the promo code? Free. I love this website. Cool. So that's done. Um, Basically has confirmed a few things and whatever. Basically, all of that has gone into this particular database. So that's the point that I was trying to make as well, that in all of the things that is going on right now, I'm kind of looking at this and then just give me a minute. Yep. And this is basically going to this particular service. And if I just look at, yep, that's good. It's all there. And if I connect with this, and there is a table, order tables. So it literally has got my entry now. So this is, if you think about it, very, very minuscule kind of level of data, but still you can see that this is capturing the data. This is the most recent kind of transaction, and this is just one of the tables where the data has been generated, right? So in this particular case, what just happened? Um, we have an application which is more like an e-commerce store. Let me exaggerate that. Why not? And with this e-commerce store, there are tons of things going on. So within that, if I just go back here, so it could have a lot of details. It could have the website. You don't know this, but there is actually not one website. It actually is three instances. I've actually deployed the full-blown DevOps in this. There is just one kind of site that you're seeing, but actually there are replicas of this. If something goes wrong with my production site, I can go and falter back onto this, right? So resiliency, this, that, whatever, right? There are tons and tons of things from enterprise architecture point of view, which has gone into it. And it's not complete, but still, I'm just calling it out. From then on, it has got monitoring going as well, right? These, if you think about it, these services that I'm talking to or I'm looking at right now, these also have their own data being generated. I'm not focused on that data right now, but there are teams, there are businesses which will focus specifically on that alone, right? But anyways, the crux of the service is there is a web service or app service, and that's an application, business application. Instead of that, it could be SAP system, it could be Dynamics 365, it could be Salesforce, it could be enterprise or e-commerce, platform, as I said. And end of day, at some point, it will be writing data somewhere. In my case, that's an Azure SQL database. It can be MongoDB, it can be Oracle, it can be SAP systems or SAP HANA or whatever that is. And those systems are the one which are generating the data. And that's what I meant by generation, right? Um, so let's go back onto the session itself. So in this particular case, what we looked at is we looked at a sample case of real-time application where a web app is the front end where users can connect and interact. And there is an operational data store, which is basically writing data into Azure SQL. Yep. I think somebody has gone off mute. Yep. Thank you. Um, and that's what I meant. I mean, this is obviously the simplest thing that probably is there. Um, I can assure you for production sites, and I've managed some of those for financial domains and everything. That alone is a massive, massive piece of work, right? But anyways, there can be other patterns as well. So, for example, instead of instead of an app, it could be a telemetry system. End of day, if you think about it closely, whether it's a handheld device, whether this is a service running somewhere in the cloud, or if it's a function, or it's a service which is running on a server, or on your desktop, or in your watch, doesn't matter what it is, or in your bicycle, they basically are generating data points, and that data point is basically then is stored in a particular data store. In this particular example, for this is Event Hub. So basically, these are multiple instances of the same application. They could be writing onto Event Hub. And once Event Hub has received the data, in this particular case, for example, this is then is transmitted over to Stream Analytics. And Stream Analytics is basically then becoming the distribution engine because from this, it can feed data into machine learning or even can receive input from there in the real time if it wants to, change the aggregations, for example, or certain parameters of the computations, for example. It could also be feeding directly into SQL data warehouse for long-term analysis of what's going on in a month or what is the pattern of events like, say in a month. You will not find that every 5 minutes, right? You will only find that once you have received data for a month, for example. And then there is a different line of consumption which is going to Power BI as well. Imagine that being a report, and in that this particular case, for example, we are looking at two examples. One is the real-time statistics, which is coming out at a set out frequency of, I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever basically, is being set here. And there is one set of report that users can look at, which is indicating every 5 minutes I'm getting these many errors or these many events, basically. But then the same system, but through a different report or through a different interface, for example, could also be looking at more of a historical data analysis as well, looking at how the patterns are looking like. Is it that there are more events, let's say in January, or more events in December, or whatever, right? Temperature is higher in these months, temperature is lower in these months. My fault rates are higher in these particular weeks, or my fault rates are lower in these particular weeks. So those scenarios are there, which can be there. But idea is again, if you think about this, generation over here, generation is over here, transmission is over here. And then from there on, the distribution is also, being looked at. And Event Hub is basically, taking care of the transmission, and Stream Analytics is basically looking at the distribution side of things in this particular case. Let's look at another example, right? And these are all, so by the way, I didn't call this out. All these examples that I'm talking about, they actually are coming from Azure reference architectures. So these are not pretty pictures out of Epiphany. These are backed by specific patterns, and these are backed by specific use cases. And the deck that I have, it has a very specific link to every one of them, right? In this particular example, from generation point of view, um, the the star of this conversation is IoT Hub. So what is happening is you have different IoT devices. It could be anything. It could be maybe they're checking the temperature. I'm just making it up, right? Or there is a camera feed or whatever that is. So you could have that through a car, through tablet, through your mobile phone, or there is a physical camera itself. All of these devices, they will be pushing data out onto IoT Hub. So this is where the generation is happening. And from this pattern, then on, there are different other things that can happen, right? So you have one line of consumption which is going about from here to storage blob, and through storage blob, basically it becomes more like a distribution channel if you think about it. Some of it can go into Spark in Databricks or Synapse for that matter. There is some part of consumption which is happening in SQL database. And then through Cosmos database, there is more customer ready sort of insights or telemetry or reporting that can be globally accessed through mobile network, through web applications, through APIs, or through Azure functions and everything. But the idea in this particular case is that the generation is happening here. Transmission is then taken care of, and distribution is basically a bit of more multifaceted. Um, Presume this to be more on the kind of storage blob driven. And then there is a lot of analytics, and then from there on, there is Cosmos database, which is picking up how this data is to be distributed further. So there are different junctions as well in this, if you think about it, because this Cosmos database is being consumed by these applications, but then also by functions, and functions can go and directly talk to the source as well. So this is more like looking at what's inside looking like, and then at the same time, maybe sending some commands over to IoT Hub. I don't know, right? So those sort of things can be happening in this particular case, for example. Um, so this is kind of on the generation side of things. I'll carry on to the next section as well, but I just want to take a pause here and just see if there are any questions. Um, just a very quick recap. We talked about few things here, right? So if I just go back to the main slide here, we talked about operational data stores. We talked about some of the generation patterns, for example. In particular, we looked at web app. We looked at SQL database, Azure SQL database as an example. But then there are certain other um, generation sort of services as well, and they will include things like event hubs and IoT hubs, and they can then be used to transit data over to subsequent stages. Yeah. Does Is that all making sense? Can we get some quick thumbs up if you're all following along so far? Okay. Cool. So it seems like we have pretty good following there. Um, if anybody has any questions on these, doesn't matter what the question is, please do not hesitate and put that on the chat window. I do want to make this two-way, although it's a bit of a conversation from here and then just talking and talking and talking. But I just want you to know that you are here. to receive information, but yet at the same time, you can ask anything that you like, and no question is a bad question. So I do want to put that out openly, and I truly, truly mean that. All right, so let's probably carry on to the next conversation, and that is around data factory, right? So in this particular case, what has happened basically? Um, I have I've got my data in SQL, and that's about it. So if I just go back to the main sort of example screens that I was talking about, so now let's take it to the next stage. What I want to do basically is I want to take this data, which has been generated in my parts unlimited database. And again, mind you that in my enterprise, this is one of the other, I don't know, 200 odd data sources which could be producing data. But for the simplicity of the conversation, let's just focus on one and kind of, look through. Um, okay, so there is a question. What are the advantages of data grid compared to a typical data warehouse pipeline using ETL? So, Edward, it's more like a construct that I've just built on the fly, to be very honest, right? So data grid means nothing. I started with electric grid as um, as an example, just to facilitate an understanding across different tiers of data processing and services, why there are so many data services, for example, which might look like a lot overlapping. So that is the reason why I started with electric grid as a real world example. And then I draw some parallels with it and hence used or kind of derived the word data grid there, right? Data grid itself in its own right means nothing, right? I don't want to invent a new term. There is already data mesh, there is already distributed data, and there are tons of other things. So data grid doesn't mean anything there. Data warehouse is one among the, I don't know, hundreds of other patterns of how data is transformed and it's traveling within an enterprise ecosystem, right? So data warehouse is a set out pattern. There is ETL, as you rightly called out. There is AI, there is machine learning, there is data mesh that's going about. These are all different patterns. There is distributed data as well, for example. Um, Data grid is just kind of referring to all of them together. Warehouse will also create a grid. AIML will also create a grid, and that's it. Perfect, perfect. Um, okay, so we paused at the generation sort of conversation, and we talked about web app and Azure SQL database. Azure SQL database is one among the many operational data stores that I have. Now, what I want to do is I want to transmit this data over to something which can help me distribute this data, or this can become a place where everybody can basically come in and talk to it. And that service which I want to use is called Data Factory. So let's just go and open Data Factory in this. Okay. So if I just look at this, let me just get out of this one. Now, if I look at what's going on here, so I will talk about that. Plus, what I want to do is I also want to look at our storage system. So what I've effectively done is I've basically um, decided that I will use my storage account, Azure Data Lake storage account, as my container, as my placeholder, which can help me distribute data, right? This becomes facilitator for distribution. Anybody who comes, so rather than me pushing data to different systems for consumption, I'm effectively creating a service where everybody can come if they have the right level of, permissions. They can come to this central service and they can help themselves. They can receive data that they want or they should need. Um, and for me to be able to get the data there, I'm using Data Factory. Right. So let's just look at this for a minute. So what I've done in this particular case is a very simple thing. There is absolutely, I can't imagine me creating anything simpler than this. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, let's go and get the tables from my source. So what my source is, I've defined that source already. So my source is my database service. So let me just quickly go and look at my linked service. So there are a few linked services that I've basically done. There is a Parts Unlimited source database, which is my SQL database. And I've created my target Azure Data Lake storage where I want to write the data. Right. So these are two kind of sources which I want to work with in this example. So first, I'm getting the list of tables which I want to extract. As you can see, I'm not doing anything other than just getting the list of tables I can transition, and from then on, I basically give a query which says, hey, whatever, 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 give me the table names from this definition. So I have got that. And then from then on, you don't have to memorize all of this. This is like, there are tons of other options here as well. So let's probably not worry about that as such. Let's presume that we're masters of this. Um, but basically, I've got a way of looking up what tables are there because I'm basically trying to bring in everything. And then for each of those, I want to execute certain things. So first is I'm getting the data values and everything. And then there is a for each loop, so to speak, and each loop will execute an activity, right? And that activity is basically copy data. So I've created all of these basically. Very simple things, but still. So I that same thing, and then I get my data. So again, these are stock standard things that you can check out on internet any day or on Microsoft documentation as well. And then there is a sync. So sync and target are two kind of synonyms, if I may say that here. And why is it that there is a term sync and not a target system here is because the way these systems are created, Azure Data Factory, and there are a few others as well. This is, by the way, a term quite popular in open source as well, by the way, just for context. And the reason why the word sync is being used is not because it's dirty. The reason is because this could be this particular this particular target system could be target for one pipeline or one job, but for the next job, it actually is nothing but my source, right? So if you just start doing the whole source to target, it becomes really, really kind of complicated. And that's the reason why the word sync is actually being more and more popular, because once it reaches one sync, it can go and transition onto so many different other systems as such, right? And if you think about it, in this particular case, the source is actually not this job. The source is actually the actual data source itself, right? So the transition of the nomenclature for source is quite prevalent and quite visible. But the concept of sync instead of target is what I just talked about. Anyways, so in this particular case, I've basically got a copy data job, which will be repeated for every single table. So what I've done is I've just provided the data sync or data set, which I showed you earlier, which is basically referring to Azure Data Lake Storage. And yeah, and literally quite that's it. It's all running through code objects. These are dynamic objects, for example. So I've not referenced a particular example or particular table directly. I've basically used the references. And in the runtime, when with this job runs, this thing will basically step through the whole set of tables, and it will kind of load the data. Actually, no, before I trigger that, let's also look at the storage account. So this is a storage account. What I've done, there is a concept of containers in here. Um, you can basically control permissions or accessibility to different levels within storage account, and containers provide me that feature as well. So that's the reason I've created that. So basically, I've created a container called PUL data. So this is PUL data right now. You can see that, which is parts unlimited data. And within that, there is a raw folder. So this is empty right now. This is where I want to dump my data, right? So what is happening? I'm going to my source system, again, SQL database, ODS. I am looking at list of tables, not one, not two, every one of them. And then I just want to copy data from each of those tables. And then I just want to place them in a data lake storage. And that becomes my distribution layer. So why it becomes distribution layer is because then anybody within my organization, for example, they can then come and interact with that service and source the data out if they need to. Yeah. So let's go there. Let's trigger the job, um, and see what happens. Fingers crossed. So let's go to the monitor. Yep, that's going on right now. And you can see the progress here as well. So you see what has happened? It basically has triggered so many jobs at the same time, right? So depending on certain parameters which are set in this particular job, it's kind of working through. So it's having few jobs which are in queue, some which are in progress. So get tables is completed already. Yeah, here we go. So it actually has completed the job as well. And I can come back onto this. I can look at what all different things have happened. I can also check out my dashboards, how many has been this and that. So again, the idea is not to kind of walk through the whole service, although I'm happy to if somebody is unsure of it. And if I just come back here on storage, so this is what has happened, right? It basically has dumped all of the data. Again, I could have gone and structured the nomenclature a bit more better, which I missed out. But I didn't want to kind of, just superficially create something which, looks super, super solid or super, super done, sort of, so to speak. These sort of things can happen when we are developing, right? I didn't realize this. I dumped the data as is. I can then go back and change this as well. I can change the logic here when it's generating my names and everything of the files, and I can go and basically run that again if I want to. Yeah. But anyways, the point is, what I've just done is I've gone on to the transmission layer, and in that transmission layer, I'm connecting to my data source, one of the data source, and I'm basically bringing in all the tables that it has onto my distribution layer. And that distribution layer happens to be my Azure Data Lake storage. And once it's landed there, and it has now, I can basically go and consume it any ways I want. I can access it through command lines. I can use storage accounts or storage explorer, whatever you have, right? So all of those things can be done to access the data and consume it in the way that I want. So distribution layer is also, in this way, if you think about it, is being taken care of by this. Yeah. So let's carry on with this example. Um, so this is a similar sort of scenario, and rather than me just looking at my e-commerce portal or e-commerce kind of front end, web front end, you could be needing customers insights, and that customer insight is actually coming through Dynamics here, if you think about it. But predominantly, if you think about it, what is going on here is that you have data in Salesforce, in SAP system, in different apps that you have. There are certain data pieces on file shares. There are databases lying around and everything, and you need to bring it all in, right? And ADF basically, if I just go back momentarily, If I just look back here, and if I look at linked service, if I just want to define a linked service, so these are the different kind of systems that I can connect to, depending on who is what. Um, they all are the sources, and generally speaking, most of them are my target slash sync systems are as well. So these are different sources through which I can read data, but then I can write onto predominant majority of them as well. Yeah. Where I can't find specific service to connect to, it also has ODB, CO data, and REST and everything. And you will see a slide pretty soon. It can actually talk to so many data sources. It's just not funny, right? Sometimes I also kind of, get a bit lost on what is the right mechanism to connect with this data source, for example. I mean, yeah, I get lost as well. But any which ways, the point is that Azure Data Factory can go and connect with all these data generators. Can be Salesforce, can be SAP, can be your custom applications or web applications or your file shares or data stores, relational, non-relational, semi-relational, whatever it is. All of that you can bring in. And then from there on, what happens is this becomes a distribution layer. Now, I do want you to be careful though. I'm I'm calling it out as distribution layer because everybody's coming and getting data from here. They have to pull data from this layer, right? They can be doing their own stuff as well, but that's not the point. The key point here is that distribution can be of two different modalities. Distribution can be pushed, as in I am sending water and electricity to your house. Consume it if you want to, right? Um, and then it could be pull as well. If I want somebody to, I don't know, come and cut the grass in my house, for example, that's a pull mechanism. I have to request somebody or I have to reach somebody for them to come and visit, right? Um, so that's a push and pull sort of a scenario. When it comes to data lake, generally speaking, it's a pull mechanism. Um, unless you have a very specific scenario where you have basically written data onto data lake and you want to trigger an event, and that event gets triggered automatically. And because of that automated trigger, you can then invoke a function which can do certain things automatically. Right. So for example, image classification is generally a stock standard example being quoted on this. But again, you know, here you go. Um, Coming back onto this particular example, I have these different data stores, different data generators. ADF or Azure Data Factory is my transmission line, um, or provides the transmission lines. Um, Through that, I land data onto Azure Data Lake. That becomes my distribution um, platform. Through that distribution platform, Customer Insights, which is our Dynamics 365 service, it can come and read data from there, and whatever it needs to write, it can write back onto data lake as well. Maybe in a separate container, maybe in the same container, doesn't matter, right? That is something that you can define. And the same is being distributed or consumed by Azure Synapse as well. So Synapse can do certain aggregations on top of that, which will further be consumed by Power BI. Right. So in this particular case, you can see that distribution channel is basically doing its job. Custom Insight has one consumption pattern. Synapse and Power BI has another consumption pattern. Right. Let's look at this one. So here you go. This is what I was talking about, that you could do so many things with this. Imagine this particular scenario, which is more like a logical data warehouse. Um, and what is happening in this particular case is again a similar thing. You have, interestingly, two transmissions here, two transmission lines, so to speak. There is one which is going on ADF. Again, that is quite visible. So the same ADF can go and talk to so many different sources. So these are some of the popular online services, for example. There is MongoDB, and then these are more like traditional data stores. There is also Synapse, apparently. There is storage as well. Then these are some of the systems which are more on, relational store containment, I guess. And then some more around HDFS and SAP HANA and everything. So basically, pretty much through everything, right? So data factories, it's not like it's all going in here and then somewhere else. No, it's more like orchestration of the transmission lines. And then from that orchestration, data basically is landing into your data lake. This is your distribution channel again. There is another distribution pathway here, which is more like you have edge devices, which are writing onto IoT Hub, and those IoT Hub are then read by Stream Analytics, which is the transmission line for this particular pathway. So this transmission line then transfers back again onto data lake storage, which becomes your distribution channel. And through this distribution channel, there are a few other sort of consumption patterns which are coming around. For example, in this particular case, this is going through serverless. Through that, it's Cosmos for more real-time transactional apps or reporting or whatever. There is more traditional historical reports and everything as well that's going about. That can be Power BI, that can be whatever XYZ reporting tool that you might want to look at and talk about, right? So that's another example that's there from the perspective of what you can cover when it comes to transmission as well. Michelle, just checking in. Should we carry on, or do you want to add a break or anything?
Up to you. If you need a break, then have like a 5 minute comfort break. If you don't, then carry on, I guess.
Okay, so let's probably carry on because I think with the current pace and depending on how many questions we have, we might wrap up a little early, but let's see how we go. Yeah. Um, the next is around distribution. So let's now talk about distribution as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Synapse now. And within Synapse, I'm going to exhibit two separate sort of consumptions, if I may reference here. So again, the same sort of things. Let's probably kill this. Let's probably kill this as well. We don't need that. Data we still need. So let's keep that on. And let's go to Synapse now. So again, we have moved forward in our journey. We started with generation. We then transmitted data using ADF. We landed onto our ADLS, Azure Data Lake Storage. Within that, I've basically dumped the data, and that's my distribution channel through which or to which different services can come about. Now with Synapse, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of showcase that it's actually not one service but two. Just very quickly, because Synapse is such a wider topic, let me just bring about a visual which will help you. Give me a minute. I think I've probably misplaced it. Won't be too long, just a minute. So this visual that I'm referring to, it's not from Microsoft. It's from a gentleman called Mr. Paul Andrews. I love his work. Some of the concepts and some of the clarifications he has provided. It's pretty amazing actually. There are some more as well within Microsoft. James Serra is another very good a person to follow through. I myself look at his work every now and then. But again, it's a pretty good visual, and I thought that it actually represents the sense of what's going on in Synapse. So I thought I'll just bring about right. Without going a lot into detail, what's happening here is that Synapse actually is not one service. You can see that every one of these things is actually running in Synapse, right? Synapse has some of the integration, details as well, how it can go and talk to different sources. So as data factory, Azure Data Factory, can go and talk to so many different sources. The reality is that Synapse can do exactly the same things, at least, somewhat same things. So it depends on where you're going with this. Synapse is pretty good in that regard. Um, from the transmission line of conversation as well, it also has a concept called Synapse Link. And among other sources, it can, for example, talk to Cosmos database and bring in the near real-time data consumption or transmission from an operational system into Synapse for analytics or for analysis, right? So whichever way you want to go. The key part that I wanted to focus on right now is that within Synapse, for the ongoing analysis of the data, it actually provides multitude of options of how you want to interact with the data, right? In particular, and they all are in somewhat, independent sort of rigor, if I may say that. So there is a serverless capacity within Synapse, which we're going to use, by the way, as well, which is almost like its own entity in its own right. It also has Apache Spark Pool, which again has its own entity and kind of capacity and everything, and then dedicated SQL pool, which has its own, encapsulation and kind of, detailing and everything. There is also Data Explorer, which is not visible on this one because this visual is a bit dated. But nonetheless, I think this kind of, presents the information quite a lot well, and hence the reason I just wanted to leverage this, and go with that. On top of each of these capacities, you can do a lot of development. So transformation and retaining the data and everything. And then these systems can be brought about. For example, Power BI can hook onto this and create reports using that, right? So that's the kind of overall sort of breakdown. If anybody needs this visual, do let me know. I'll be happy to share the URL of this. But again, this is from Mr. Paul Andrews. If you want to search, you can go forward with that as well. Within this, let's just now jump back onto Synapse Service. So I've created a Synapse workspace. It literally is called a workspace because you actually have so many things that can happen within this, or different options as well. So I have not created a dedicated SQL pool. I'm going to use serverless capacity, but in its own right, it's 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 um it's a directly referenceable, directly usable service, which is not related to other services, for example. So you're not talking to one Synapse at large. You're talking to serverless or Apache Spark or ADX or dedicated SQL pool, right? So I'm going to use serverless in as one of the examples. Very basic, but still. I have also created a Spark pool because I just wanted to exhibit that notebook sort of a scenario. Again, very simple, very dummy one, but still, why not? There is Data Explorer pool as well. I am not creating that. If I wanted to, for example, I can go and create a dedicated SQL pool, and I can decide, and you can see this will be a separate unit of its own. So I can call this, let's actually look at this. So this is MSA dedicated SQL, right? And I want the least capacity because I'm just demoing things. Additional settings, anything here, there, nothing. Tags, let's keep it simple right now. Not ideal, but let's keep it simple. Um, and I'm basically just, standing on this unit as well. So effectively what is going to happen is that um, within Synapse, you can see this if I just look at the service now. So within Synapse, by virtue of this, it already has a serverless SQL pool, serverless SQL capacity. You can see that I have got a Spark pool already, which is in its own capacity as well. And what I'm going to do is now I'm going to interact with the same data using this. So let's just go and explore the data. And I've already linked, as in I've created this service in a way that is already looking on my storage account. And which storage account? The one that I referenced as my distribution channel, right? So you can see that I have PUL data here. And within that, I can see that I have got my raw storage. And within that, you can see that I have all sort of, different files that I have generated or which I want to work with. They're all here. And if I, without going into development, I'm not intending to do development and kind of, exhibit that. If I just click on one of this, you can see that there are certain options. I can work with SQL script and then notebook as well, and few other bits and pieces. So I can do data factory related work, or I can go and do SQL work. So let's look at this, because the idea is not to do anything fancy, to kind of see what's going on. Um, so very carefully, if you think about this, what is happening is I'm using the built-in, and I'm using I'm not using dedicated SQL pool. I'm basically looking at using serverless pool. So if I just run this data, so right now it's actually engaging with the flat file, which is on the storage or ADLS right now. I can do more of these things if I want. And this is all out of the box, right? So this is basically looking at all of these different transactions which could be there or whatever, and I can basically engage with that. This in itself, if you think about it, what it's actually doing is it's showing there is a consumption pattern here. So serverless is my consumption without creating the service permanently. I can allow my users to come and interact with that storage account, and I can limit that. So whichever account that they're logging in with and what permissions on data lake they have, according to that, they can exchange or they can interact with the data lake service, right? I can filter data out. I'm not creating heaps of other objects. You can see this. If I just go back onto this, I can go and create a lot of other objects like my own database, my own lake house, my own procedures, my views and external tables and everything. I'm not doing that right now, but that's kind of just showcasing that these are all enabled by this by storage. Let's also look at notebook. So you have already looked at the SQL side of consumption. Let's consume the Spark pool. And this will probably start the new nodes now, which is fine. So the reason why it's taking time is because if I just show you, the way these services are created, as in the pool ones, um, they're actually set up to shut down after some time automatically. So if there is no activity so the current setting is that if there is no activity for 15 minutes, shut down all my nodes, and so that when I need it, just bring it back on. So this is basically trying to do that right now. But the idea is that exactly the same data. Previously, I accessed it as a SQL object, although it's a flat file stored on storage account. So that's one consumption pattern as such. And then other end, I'm basically running a Spark notebook, which is going to engage with the same data set, but now as a Python PySpark object and creating a data frame out of it. Yeah. So let's probably carry on if that's okay. We'll come back to the screen a bit later if that's all right. It's not started, that's what it's saying. Cool. So let's probably carry on in our session anyways. We will come back onto this once it's done because it's starting up my notes as well right now. So that was there on the distribution side. Again, there are other things that can be done, right? There are a multitude of so many options that's there. Um, in this particular example, there is basically serverless event processing that's happening. So there are different devices. For example, again, this is a set out architecture reference sample and example that you can look up as well if you like. Um, from here, events are captured by event hubs. And by virtue of event hub receiving it, event hubs and storage account as well now, they actually have a way of saying, okay, a event has been received. And then depending on certain criteria, a trigger is generated because of that. And when that trigger happens, one of the action items that can be accommodated is firing off a function. So in this particular case, what it's actually doing, if there is an event hub which is receiving the event data from these different applications, they can then go and write. So on one end, function will go and write onto Cosmos database, and on other end, it can basically send out the later messages. Think of them as, I don't know, physical flyers which needs to be sent out. I'm just making it a completely. But if that's to be done, it can basically be then put onto a storage queue, and that could have some specific further functions which will go and print up these different messages and then send them out to different users or different account members or whatever. But the idea is that it's all orchestrated, it's all automated, um, and you can see that in this particular case, the distribution channel is actually being managed by functionality, depending on the what the event is of or the nature of the event. It can go and write onto a system as a log, for example, let's say, and then in another example, it can go and push that message as well, or only on a storage queue, which will go and fire off other functions as well, which is not shown up here. There are more services here on the sidelines, which is more like Azure pipelines and monitoring and everything. That that being because you might well have a scenario where you want to just add more regions of this and more number of services of these, depending on where in the world these events are basically coming through as well. Um, this one is a bit kind of noisy, um, but let's talk about the very specific scenario that we looked at, and the crux of this visual is actually at the right in the middle, and that's where ADLS is. So again, there are so many different data sources which are receiving the data. And then from there on, you transmit data through pipelines, data factory or not. This particular case, this is showing up as Synapse pipelines, by the way. You basically receive the data out, and then data lakes storage receive it, right? So there are certain sources which is coming through this particular pathway. There are certain sources which are coming through this as well. So there is event hub, there is IoT hub, the receiving streaming data, event data, and everything. And because they have been received here through different functions, for example, they might be written off to data lake as well, right? And this becomes my distribution channel because then I can have my serverless and dedicated SQL pools talk to it for specific aggregations. Now that the reference has fallen upon us, let's see, it's still going on. Okay. Uh, okay, that's taking a bit longer. But anyways, let's carry on. Um, so this is basically being consumed by serverless and dedicated SQL pools. Um, this can also be referenced directly by Spark pools in different capacity. This could be looking at yesterday's data. This could be looking at data received in the pockets of months, as in current month, previous quarter, previous year, previous 5 year, right? Or whatever, right? So when you have this sort of a thing going on, um, this can go and fire off different things depending on what sort of nature of the data that it wants to work with and derive its own outcomes. And then there's explore tool, which is again part of the Synapse. But the idea that I want to get across is that you're able to interact with it, and they all are within the Synapse workspace as well. But effectively, they are actually independent consumption patterns. They're independent services. In fact, they could be completely different and distinguished teams which are able to access these resources as such, right? So these are not the same service. They actually are separate consumption patterns, if I may call that out. Right. So and from there on, different things can happen, right? This can go into cognition services. This can go to Power BI, Cosmos for further, application integrations and things like that, data share or cognitive services, whatever you have, right? So sky's the limit there, I guess. Now let's talk about Power Automate. So this is the one example where I'll actually not run it, but I'll also talk about some of the use cases that can emerge out of it. But let's see them anyway. Okay, so where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Give me a minute. I seem to have killed my Power Automate screen. So I just want to go and talk about this. This is failing for a certain reason. I was trying to kind of make it work just today morning, and something is not right about it right now. But let me just anyways talk about this as well. Um, this is rather a quite simplistic sort of flow, and you could go in different directions. So with Power Automate, you can do a lot of things, but predominantly, if I just look at one of the example, what I'm thinking of doing is that, okay, I know my data source, which is, the very specific data source as well, for my data generation pattern. I'm hooking onto that directly, but effectively, I can also look at my Synapse now, or even my data lake as well. From there, that I've captured ordered, I've captured email of the user, and I can basically go and shoot off an email to the very specific users. So if something new has been received, if there is a new alert that I want to send out to them, or just about anything, right? So this is just one of the things that it can do. There are tons and tons of connectors that it can work with. Um, and the idea is that you can create the low code sort of applications using this, and depending on what data you have captured on your Synapse or in your distribution channels or in your individual services or on different kind of data stores that I showed you earlier, and through there you can see that this is such a massive list, and these are all data driven in some capacity or other, right? You capture the data, and these are all reflective of different specific um, consumption patterns that you can derive out of it. I didn't want to just, put a very dead end sort of Power BI report at the end. But the idea is that these data sources, these data systems can then be connected up for low code applications, and they can become their own ecosystem as well. In some cases, you can actually have the last outcome of the data and then do some analytics with it, or some AI or cognition services integration with it. And whatever result that come out of it, I call that feedback loop. You can basically feed back to your core source or generated applications, and the cycle basically continues. If you just want to look at the Power BI sort of things as well, I've not created a report as such, but the same thing can be done in this regard too, where if I just throw this particular visual, what you can do is you can basically bring out data sources, and you can, do a lot of massaging and everything of the data, and then work with the whole Power BI service ecosystem, and kind of, lead to the reports that can be used by your end users. And that can also have a bit of a data gateway based connectivity back to your data sources as well, right? Um, let's just carry on as well in this regard now. When it comes to consumption, it really again depends on how further you want to go with this. There can be an application and then an application follow after that. Consumption is basically, more like a series of steps, or it can be one pointed end of consumption. It doesn't matter. But for example, in this particular case, I'm ingesting my data through Data Factory. So transmission is done. I'm ready for my distribution. And in that, this whole ecosystem from here onwards becomes my consumption pattern. So in this particular pattern, I'm basically invoking AML through AML testing and training and everything. I've basically created a runtime endpoint, and that runtime endpoint is basically informing or helping specific, you know, specific to a team, specific to a department, or specific to a user base, certain applications. Which can be low code applications as well, right? So, for example, I talked about that send the email to users. So, case in point, if order amount is less than $100, do this. If the order amount is more than $100 or less than 1,000, do this. If it's more than $1,000, ring somebody and talk to them and say, call them right now. Because they're spending a lot of money on your systems. Good thing, right? But still, you can see where it all can go. Another one is intelligent apps. In this particular case, if you think about it, what's happening is you actually have the similar sort of cadence where you have data sources, and then there is a transmission, and then distribution. So distribution channel is here, but depending on what's going on, through its own complex kind of, controls and everything, function can basically go and write onto a data tier, and that can trigger events, or that can trigger specific executions through which intelligent applications, which can be on, let's say, a web application, and can also be having integrated Power BI reports. Um, at the endpoint or the specific premium capacity as well, you can basically go and invoke all of that and embed all of that as one specific scenario as well. And all of this is all falling within consumption, right? So the key takeaway there is that when it comes to consumption, it's not one dead end of the service, and that's where consumption ends. The consumption itself can have its own journey from there on. If you think about it, it could trigger certain applications, and then some more applications, and then maybe the dead end of the application, or it could just be the one service. So just be conscious of that when it comes to something like this. Right. So we still have about half an hour to go. I've only a few slides left now. Let's see if there are any questions. I hope this is all making sense. I haven't seen a lot of questions coming about, but I'm hoping that's a good sign. Can we get some quick thumbs up if you are still here and following along all well? Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Perfect. So look, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them on the chat window. If I can read them right away and answer them. If I can't, I'll at least have a log and I can come back to it. Right, so let's look at the references, right? Again, to be very fair, there is no end to references, right? I was a bit conscious of, what are the ones that we probably call out, but maybe I'll probably start with these, right? If you are more driven by the visuals and videos and want to listen and everything, the top two are ak.ms/shows and then Azure Friday. So these two will have ongoing sort of, videos and content that's coming about. If you are following along, the very amazing Michelle here, she also has lots and lots of contributions out there already, and she just carries on with it as well, right? So hats off to you, Michelle, for everything that you're doing, and so much that you put out there for the community. I personally have learned a lot as well, but nonetheless, there are different resources and different leaders available who you can follow, and you will definitely learn just by virtue of by surrounding yourself with these resources. um Thanks, Paula, I appreciate that. The other reference, if you just want to kind of jump um your learning curve a bit, is look at ak.ms/architecture or code samples. This is where you want to kind of take your learning to the next level. You want to understand the systems, not just the components or how to's, right? Code sample is when you're ready to go and try out things, basically. Architecture, basically talking about patterns and how things are being done in an enterprise scale or grade sort of application as such. And if you want to go even further than that and really want to prove what you have got, not just for others, but to yourself as well, I personally see certifications as proving to myself where it stands as an independent sort of voice coming to me or a number coming to me. But nonetheless, certifications are available. You can again go and check out ak.ms/certifications. There are tons of resources, not just the certification links, but if you see them, if you browse that particular URL and find the one that you want or few that you want, you will see that they actually have the learning path embedded within them. So you just have to literally go through and try it out. Um, yeah, sure, definitely. Let me jump onto the DevOps as well. Good point, Michelle. I'll talk about that as well. And then you have ak.ms slash learn, the very amazing resource. Believe it or not, within Microsoft, that's where we go to as well, right? Um, that's where a lot of content is. That is where the most current content is. It's either that or docs.microsoft.com. These are the two resources which are generally my go-tos. There are blogs and there are different resources and everything, and definitely I have all the credits and references to them. But the reality is, when I want to make sure that I'm looking and talking the right thing, um, I do trust only docs.microsoft.com and then the learn side as well to some extent. I've also embedded certain links depending on which direction you want to take as well. Data engineer, data scientists, AI engineers, developers, or solution architect. These are different links that's available. Plus, there are tons more, right? So don't just look at this as that's it. This is going to give you, I don't know, maybe an year's worth of read material, and then you will have some more, right? So you can spend a good part of your life just learning. I'm still learning as well. Um, On to the point that Michelle called out, let's just quickly look at the part. So this application that I showed you, right? This particular web app, this is actually, I think this is this. Mm, Yep. Mm, This one, yeah, sorry. I have few going on. It's always a bit of a blank for a moment. Um, so what I've got here is I've got certain of these applications, and you can see that I've I'm basically using Azure DevOps. Um, it is our one-stop port where we can go and everything that's going on from code perspective, it's all here, right? So I can work with my boards, as in planning my activities and everything. That's all here. I can look at my backlogs and everything. That's for those who are looking at managing the IT deliveries and software deliveries and everything. So that's on the side of that. So there is a planning around how many activities we want to do, how do we plan different sprints and epics and everything. So that's that. It's a conversation in its own right. I used to go and deliver these trainings back in the day, so I'm kind of a bit conscious of that. That I don't want to go a lot further. But this is how it's looking like. For example, when it comes from backlogs and your boards and everything. Your repos are here. So this is your code repo. So this is a sample code repo that I've got. Um, my docs, my environment, my source code, my test, and everything. All of that is in one place. And the idea is that application that you saw earlier, which was this one, and the database which was created as an effect of that, plus the configuration of deploying different stages and different application insights for monitoring my application, all of that code is actually sitting here, all of that, right? Um, and the idea is that we code that's going into repository. Actually, no, before that, walk back. Um, Basically, we start planning what we want to do, how we want to do it, what is the capacity, how much, how far, how quickly, and everything. So that's your backlog and board and everything. So there is a bit of a planning around before you start. Then your code repository comes about. You start coding different components, different pieces, and whatnot. And once you have done that, or have started doing it, you start working with pipelines. So this is my delivery pipeline. So I'm sure you have heard of the term CI and CD. So what is CI and what is CD? So CI is continuous integration. So that's more concurrent. So as I'm writing code into my repository, I want it to be integrated to what I have done or what my team has done so far. So that's a bit more aggressive. It can happen every 5 minutes, every check-in, whatever your capacity, set out. And then there is continuous deployment, which is basically I have figured there is a good enough build, and maybe on a set frequency or maybe on a set capacity, or maybe manually, I want to go and deploy that to different environments, right? So that's the continuous deployment sort of conversation. So if I just look into this one, so for example, there is a pipeline which I'll show soon. So you see this? This is my artifact. This is more like, this is ready to go. This is one done deal, so to speak. That done deal is actually coming from pipeline. So we'll jump onto that, but presume that is done. Our build is successful, and I think it's gold, and I think it can be deployed. That's where the stages of deployment comes about, and you start talking about dev and production. So for example, in my case, I'm saying, okay, I will go and deploy my application, which is a composition of core code, web app, then database, table definitions, and XYZ, and then configurations like app insights. All of that I will go and deploy, and they will have one job and one task. So again, that's kind of more details underneath that. So where it will go, what is the Azure environment details and everything. I've parameterized all of it. So if you see this is all running off a sample application. This is the resource group, and I can check out my resource group here. So I've basically defined my resource group to be that, my hosting plan to be that, my server name to be that, and all of these are the ones which are actually running here. So you see this, that's the same name that you see here actually, right? And in the database, for example, right? So that is how the whole thing is kind of, is hanging on. So there is one for dev, and then you can see this through this pipeline. Basically, the way I've set it up is that if this is successful and there is a bit of a trigger for other environments as well, if that is successful and if this trigger allows, then go and deploy to the next environment as well. So that's how you do the continuous deployment from a successful build. Now let's look at that as well. So this is what is happening here if you look at this. So this, if I just look at this pipeline, so this is normal build process, right? So again, I'm talking about the source side of application. This is where generation of data is happening. So what is happening here is I'm getting a NuGet resource. So this is more like, my build environment setup. Then I'm building the solution, for example. And then once I have built the solution successfully, I copy my files somewhere because I can then kind of, deploy it again and again. So think of this as a executable, right? That I can run against any environment. So once I have copied these final set, I can then go and say publish this artifact. And once I do this publish artifact, only then I can see this. So when I publish my artifact, basically it says push to the continuous deployment, so to speak, right? So yeah, so this is kind of going on. Again, this is, I don't know, 50 or 100,000 feet sort of view of what is going on, but this is your source application. You can see that it's almost like having one of its own pathway of delivery and rigor and development and everything. So there is a dedicated SQL, sorry, not SQL, software development teams and testing teams and capacity teams and performance and platform teams and whatnot, right? They kind of are doing this. They're understanding what is the application side of conversation that needs to be taken care of. It can be e-commerce, it can be mobile commerce, it can be SAP, it can be custom built application, it can be off the shelf application, whatever that is, right? Tons and tons of integration work that's going around in the world. These are the business applications. The outcome of that is here as application which is generating data. So that's the generation engine. Generation engine kicks off. That basically leads to transmission. Transmission then leads to distribution, and distribution leads to consumption, and that consumption leads to insights and decisions. And on the basis of those decisions, you might create more applications, or you might come back and tweak your applications that have been produced in past, and the cycle just carries on. So I hope that makes sense, and is of some help. I have tried out during the session, but I'm still happy to take any questions if you have some. Let's probably just give it a minute. If anybody can think of anything to ask. Okay. Um, so look, if there is nothing else, I do want to say thank you so much to you all for being here, for attending in. I hope this was of some help to you, and something that you took something out of as well, and it excites you towards data. Um, Obviously, it's something that excites me every day, and kind of helps me get out of the bed, to be very honest. And especially Michelle, thank you so much for you as well, for bringing me in and giving this amazing audience here and the platform. Before you all go as well, again, this will be recorded, so I'm just a bit conscious. For the members who are online today, or maybe touch in tomorrow, perhaps, please scan, if you just point your mobile camera to this QR scan code, you will land onto a survey form, and I'll appreciate any feedback that you might have, good or bad. Thank you. Over to you, Michelle.
Well, thank